Next up, we have Nick Warr, a partner in the private client team at Taylor Wessing. Nick specialises in advising ultra-high net worth individuals, their families and family offices in the Middle East, USA and Europe. And Nick is going to talk about the impact of the new non-resident CGT charge on non-resident investors and trustees, non-resident property investors and how they are structuring their property purchases, and the proposed mansion tax and its likely impact on investors if it is ever implemented. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Georgie. Morning. To put this morning into context, obviously London and to a certain extent the UK property market has been fueled over the last few years by a number of different factors. London's become attractive for people looking to get away from geopolitical risk in their local regions, which has improved the cars. A lot of people have looked to move here from jurisdictions which are perceived to be high tax jurisdictions, which has improved the restaurants. And also a lot of people are looking to take advantage of the relatively benign UK tax system for UK resident non-dom individuals, which has helped all of us. But there's kind of a growing suspicion in relation to a number of foreign investors as to the fact that the UK has historically been perceived as being very stable. It takes a long time for things to change. But over the last few years, as Mike Taylor, I think, admirably pointed out, in particular in relation to UK property, which is something which is very, very close to a lot of these people's hearts, because they see this as their kind of their safe haven. Because by and large, if the tanks come down the street, what happens here would be quite scary. But where in a lot of home jurisdictions, the possibility of their property being confiscated is quite high, and therefore to have a bulb hole in particular in the UK has been kind of quite close to their heart. And they've always thought it's been very simple to own property here, but with all these changes, things are becoming more complex. So, this morning, as Georgie kindly mentioned, there's kind of three main areas. One is the proposed changes to the capital gains tax regime for non-UK resident property investors. Secondly is briefly covering, structuring for UK residential property. And finally is an overview of the various political statements which have come out in relation to mansion tax. So starting off with the capital gains tax changes, and forgive me if I'm teaching people to suck eggs here, but with effect from the 5th of April this year, the capital gains tax regime for the taxation of non-UK resident property investors is going to be widened. And basically, there'll be a CGT liability on disposal of effectively a dwelling house. So it covers not only owner-occupied, but also lesser properties which are rented out, will be subject to CGT. Those individual or people / entities caught by the changes will include trusts, individuals, companies to the extent that they're not already within the ATED capital gains tax regime, and partnerships. The kind of the headline points here are as follows. One is the rates of capital gains tax for individuals and trustees and partnership is going to be either 18 or 28%, depending on whatever the UK source income the individuals have. And for companies, if the company is not within the ATED regime, so for example, if it's a rental property as compared to an owner-occupied property, then it's going to be potentially the capital gain will be subject to a liability of 20%. As far as how the gain is calculated, effectively there's a mark-to-market as of the 5th of April. So there's a number of different ways you can kind of rebase it, either a time proportion one or a straight mark-to-market. But it's only going to be any gain after the 5th of April which will be coming to charge. So effectively accrued gain before that period won't be chargeable in certain circumstances. There's also the ability for, if you've got a kind of a portfolio of UK properties, and you realise losses, we'd be surprised if we have, but hey, on some properties and gains on another, then you effectively can pool it and offset the losses against the gains. For individuals and also for certain properties owned directly by trusts, there's also going to be the kind of widening of the principal private residence relief. And the widening basically is going to provide that it will be possible for a non-UK resident to elect the property as their main residence. But they have to spend either 90 days in that property or in another property, because the ability to elect is when you have a combination of different properties. or spend 90 days as being a UK resident. So, as Mike mentioned, there's kind of an interaction here because, bizarrely, it's still possible to benefit from the principal private residence exemption without, under the new statutory residency rules, becoming a resident in the UK. So that's kind of a whistle-stop tour of CGT. Moving on now to the one which I can never remember what I'm talking about. So the ownership of UK, or how people are structuring new acquisitions. And by and large, from you have the conversations Mike mentioned, which is kind of the practical impact, which is, do I want everyone to know that I own a UK property? Because if I do, they're probably going to kidnap my children, which some people might like. Other people don't. But you have that conversation about the practical impact, but then you talk about the pure tax impact. And by and large, the conversation, regardless of the geography where the client comes from, tends to kind of go along the following lines, is that, first of all, you kind of run through three main options. The first one is kind of personal ownership, either directly or through a nominee company if they want to retain anonymity. Secondly is through a corporate structure. And thirdly is through a trust structure. So when I say trust structure, I'm not going to bore you or kind of run through slides about how it's created, but in effect, the trustee actually acquires property directly with leverage to get around the IHT liability. So once you kind of run through the three options, you then kind of weigh up from a pure tax perspective the pros and cons of each. So for personal ownership, on the negative, obviously it's going to be within the IHT regime, so there'll be a 40% liability on their death, unless they've actually taken out borrowing to acquire the property in the first place to reduce the net equity. From a CGT perspective, in the olden days it would be obviously be exempt from CGT, so you didn't need to worry about it, but now, if it's in personal ownership, obviously there'll be a CGT liability on any gain on disposal. And finally, for the ATED charge, obviously if it's in personal ownership, you're outside the scope of ATED. Moving on to corporate ownership, and then here you have, obviously from an inheritance tax perspective, the asset here is the shares in a non-UK company, so on the basis that the individual is non-domiciled or not deemed domiciled in the UK, it's outside the scope of inheritance tax. For capital gains tax, obviously they've been within the scope of the ATED regime, and I'm talking about owner-occupied here, rather than pure rental, since 6th of April 2013, so there'll be a capital gains tax disposal and sale, and obviously they'll be within the ATED charge. And then finally, kind of moving on to trust ownership is here, on the basis that you structure it in a certain way, you can remove it from the inheritance tax regime, which normally applies to assets owned directly by trust, which applies to impose a 6% charge every 10 years. So you can remove from the IHT regime. For capital gains tax, depending on whether a beneficiary lives in the property and whether it will qualify for main residence exemption, because that also qualifies for properties owned, also occupied by beneficiaries of a trust. So by and large, you probably will be within the CGT regime, but maybe a way to get out of it if it's going to be owned by the patriarchal kids. And obviously, if it's owned by trust directly, you're outside the scope of ATED. Up until the change in stamp duty in the autumn statement, what we found is from a practical perspective, the direct trust ownership was becoming increasingly popular, especially for properties worth more than about 7.5 million upwards. Because underneath that level, commercially it doesn't really make sense, because obviously you have the ongoing costs of running the structure in the first place, and some people struggle to get their head around the fact that they don't own it, the trustees own it, and so you have to get over that kind of practical point. But since the, sort of lean back so wrong, is since the change in stamp duty, and obviously for even for non-corporate acquisitions over that's 2 minutes. 12% stamp is
getting over
2 million. So you've got 12% at the top end of the market stamp if it's acquired by a trust or an individual, as compared to 15% owned by a corporate. And so some people are saying, okay, well, what am I getting here? If I pay the ATED charge, effectively that's an option to protect me against inheritance tax long term. So what you're finding is that the older generation tend to be moving back more towards corporate ownership rather than trust or personal ownership. Finally, mansion tax. And in the eyes of a lot of clients, mansion tax and ATED have all been kind of blurred into one. And people are kind of, a lot of people think, oh, mansion tax is coming in, but aren't we already paying it for a few years ago? So obviously the origins of mansion tax goes way back to the Liberal Democrats, that jaw-dropping event back in 2009, at their conference, when they basically kind of mooted the idea of mansion tax originally. Obviously, they are in power, but not really in power, so bad luck to them. But obviously, over the last year, the Labour Party have taken it up as part of their manifesto, and it was November last year, basically the Labour Party kind of outlined their proposals. I mean, in crude terms, the sell to this is we're going to tax the rich so we can pay for the NHS. But I think the estimated revenue to be raised is 1.2 billion, which is not going to buy many nurses from Norway or wherever we buy nurses from nowadays. So it's not going to be political. In case anyone's guessed. But where mansion tax stands at the moment is that it's proposed to be introduced, this is the Labour version, for properties worth more than 2 million. I always have to refer to my notes on this because, so it's over 2 million, although it's not been determined whether it's going to be, the property, it's only going to be the surplus over the 2 million, or whether it's effectively going to be the whole value of the property, so whether it kind of kicks in at 2 million to cover the whole value. The idea is that the 2 million is going to be linked in accordance with the national increase in average house prices, which kind of, again, this is a bit bonkers because obviously if you live in Dumfries, does anyone live in Dumfries? Good. Then your property price has probably gone down about 50%, whereas if in Central London it's gone up about 50%. So it seems a bit bizarre as to how they're going to be able to adjust the base because there's such anomalies in the wider market, which obviously Liam's going to talk about. The third element is that it's going to be a self-assessment process. It's going to be similar to ATED, so it's up to the individuals themselves to assess it. And finally, there's going to be kind of a relief provisions, which is to kind of cover the asset rich but cash poor, with the idea being that you don't pay any of it during your lifetime, but when you die, they take your house back. So it's a bit like an equity release scheme gone wrong. Because God knows what interest rate they're going to charge as a result. These are Labour proposals, but the Liberal Democrats since 2009 have had some thoughts, and one or two. And unfortunately, they've actually modified their original proposals in relation to their form of mansion tax. And what they're doing, which I think is probably most sensible, is effectively thinking about introducing other layers of council tax or greater bandings of council tax to cover the more expensive properties. So that was a whistle-stop tour. What we find from a practical perspective in the market is, as far as CGT is concerned, it hasn't come yet, and therefore, kind of it's like whatever. As far as mansion tax is concerned, people are scared about it, but they're confused with ATED, so it's kind of, ATED's been around for a couple of years now, and they paid that, so it's kind of whatever. But what we are finding is that the confusion which has been caused, especially in certain geographies, is such that people are actually thinking twice. And we look at Alpha's capital from the Middle East, for example, is historically slammed out land in Mayfair or Knightsbridge, whereas now it's kind of a pause before it lands here, and we've seen increased investment into bizarrely France, but hey, and also Germany, but also the US now is becoming increasingly popular, not least because obviously the market there has been is seen as a depressed market, but we found that rather than probably 70-80% of people investing straight into the UK, probably now 50% are going into the US or somewhere else before coming here. So it's been quite a change as far as the capital movement is concerned. That's all from me.